Mail-order bride arrived to find 3 babies crying in a basket, but she became the song they slept to. The train wheezed to a stop at Copper Creek Station with a hiss of steam that seemed to echo Margaret's own exhausted sigh. She pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching the sparse crowd on the platform through the dusty glass. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she searched for a face that might belong to Thomas Brennan, the rancher who had answered her advertisement in the Chicago Tribune. Margaret Rose O'Sullivan had never imagined herself becoming a mail-order bride. 6 months ago she had been a seamstress in Boston, living in a cramped boarding house and dreaming of something more than hemming wealthy ladies' gowns for the rest of her day. But when the factory where she worked part-time closed and her landlady raised the rent, desperation had driven her to place that fateful advertisement. Young woman, 24, seeks marriage to respectable gentleman, skilled in domestic arts of sound moral character, desires home and family in the West. Thomas Brennan's letter had been brief but kind. He was a widower. He wrote in need of a wife to help manage his ranch in Montana Territory. He was 32, owned 200 acres, and promised a comfortable home to the right woman. Most importantly, he had seemed genuine in his correspondence, never making promises he couldn't keep or painting an unrealistic picture of frontier life. Now, as Margaret stepped down from the train with her single carpet bag and the wooden trunk that contained all her worldly possessions, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The October wind cut through her wool coat like a knife, and the platform was nearly empty save for a few rough-looking men loading supplies onto wagons. "Miss O'Sullivan?" She turned to see a tall man approaching, his hat pulled low over his eye. He was older than she had expected, with premature lines around his eyes and a weariness that seemed to emanate from his very bones. But his voice was gentle, and when he removed his hat she saw kind brown eyes and sandy hair that caught the afternoon light. "Brennan," she said, offering her hand, "thank you for meeting me." He shook her hand briefly, his calloused fingers gentle despite their obvious strength. "Welcome to Montana, Miss O'Sullivan. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult. Please call me Margaret." And no, it was enlightening. She had spent 3 days on various trains, watching the landscape change from the familiar brick and cobblestone of Boston to the endless prairie and now these towering mountains that seemed to scrape the sky itself. Thomas loaded her trunk onto his wagon with an efficiency that spoke of years of hard labor. As they drove through the tiny town of Copper Creek, which consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, and a small church, Margaret studied her new husband-to-be from the corner of her eye. He was handsome in a rugged way, but there was something haunted about him, sorrow that seemed to have settled into his features like dust. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, trying to break the silence that had fallen between them. "It's about 5 miles out of town," Thomas replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Good grazing land, fresh water from the creek. The house is, well, it's sturdy. Built it myself after my first wife passed." Margaret heard the catch in his voice when he mentioned Sarah and felt a pang of sympathy. "How long ago did you lose her?" 2 years come Christmas." His hands tightened on the reins. "Influenza took her quick. One day she was fine, and 3 days later—" He trailed off, then seemed to shake himself. "But that's the past. I'm grateful you answered my letter, Margaret. The ranch is too much for one person, and I could use the company." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the wagon wheels crunching over the frost-covered ground. The landscape was breathtaking, rolling hills covered in golden grass, stands of aspen trees with leaves like scattered coins, and always those magnificent mountains looming in the distance. Margaret had never seen anything so vast and wild, and despite her nervousness about her future she felt a stirring of excitement. As they crested a hill, Thomas pointed ahead. "There it is." The ranch house was larger than Margaret had expected, a 2-story log structure with a wide front porch and smoke curling from the chimney. A barn and several outbuildings dotted the property, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance. It looked like the kind of place where a person could build a real life, raise a family, put down roots that would last for generations. But as they pulled up to the house, Margaret heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of babies crying. Thomas must have heard it too, because he suddenly went rigid, his face draining of color. "That's impossible," he whispered. The crying grew louder as they approached the front porch, a desperate wailing that spoke of hunger and distress. Thomas leaped down from the wagon and bounded up the porch steps, Margaret close behind him. There, beside the front door, was a large wicker basket covered with a tattered blanket. Thomas pulled back the blanket and both he and Margaret gasped. Inside the basket were 3 babies, tiny, red-faced, and screaming at the top of their lungs. They couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, wrapped in clean but well-worn blankets. A folded piece of paper was tucked beside them. With shaking hands, Thomas picked up the note and read aloud, "Thomas, these are your brother Daniel's children, Sarah, baby Daniel, and little Mary. Daniel and Anna died of the fever last week. There's no one else. Please take care of them. They're all the family you have left." Pastor Williams. Margaret stared at the babies, her mind reeling. 3 infants. Thomas's brother's children, orphaned and left on their doorstep like foundlings in a fairy tale. The smallest one, who must be little Mary, had worked one tiny fist free of her blanket and was waving it frantically as she cried. "I don't understand," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "Daniel never wrote. I haven't heard from him in over a year. He was living down in Colorado Territory with his wife. How did Pastor Williams even know where to find me?" But Margaret wasn't listening to his confused rambling. Something had awakened in her chest, a fierce protective instinct she had never experienced before. These babies were cold, hungry, and alone in the world. Whatever complications this brought to her marriage arrangement, whatever it meant for her future, they needed help now. "We need to get them inside," she said firmly, already reaching for the basket. "They're freezing, and they sound hungry. Do you have milk? Any supplies for babies?" Thomas stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. No. I mean, there might be some condensed milk in the pantry, but I don't know anything about babies. Margaret, I can't. This changes everything. I understand if you want to take the next train back to Boston. This isn't what you signed up for." Margaret looked down at the 3 crying babies, then up at this man who had suddenly become responsible for them. She thought about her empty room in Boston, her uncertain future, the loneliness that had driven her west in search of something more. Then she thought about the letter she had received from her sister just before leaving, announcing the birth of her 4th child, and how Margaret had felt that familiar pang of longing for a family of her own. "Brennan," she said, lifting the basket with determination, "I came here to build a life and a family. It appears the family has arrived a bit ahead of schedule, but that doesn't change my intention. Now, are you going to help me get these children inside and fed, or are you going to stand there gawking while they cry themselves hoarse?" Something shifted in Thomas's expression, surprise giving way to admiration, then to a tentative hope. He stepped forward and opened the door, ushering her inside the warm house. The interior was sparse but clean, with handmade furniture and a large stone fireplace that dominated the main room. Margaret could see touches that must have belonged to Sarah: a sampler on the wall, curtains at the windows, a rocking chair positioned near the hearth. But there was no time to examine her new home now. "The kitchen," she said briskly. "We need to warm some milk and find something to feed them with. Do you have any clean rags? And we'll need to change them. These blankets are soaked through." For the next hour, Margaret and Thomas worked together in a kind of frantic choreography. Thomas found condensed milk and heated water on the stove, while Margaret improvised feeding bottles from clean rags and small medicine bottles she found in the kitchen. It was messy, inefficient work, but gradually the babies' cries subsided as they took turns feeding the hungry infant. Little Mary, the smallest, was the most difficult to feed. She kept turning her head away from the makeshift bottle, her cries weak and pitiful. Margaret finally gave up on the bottle and simply dipped her finger in the warm milk, letting the baby suck it from her fingertip. "She's so tiny," Margaret murmured, cradling the infant against her chest. "How old do you think they are?" 3 weeks, maybe a month, Thomas said, looking helplessly at baby Daniel, who had finally stopped crying but was staring up at him with solemn dark eyes. I can't believe Daniel is gone. And Anna, she was such a sweet girl. They were so happy when they got married. Tell me about them, Margaret said softly, settling into the rocking chair with little Mary. The baby had finally taken some milk and was beginning to doze, her tiny fist curled against Margaret's chest. Thomas sat heavily in a chair by the fire, still holding baby Daniel. The third child, Sarah, was sleeping peacefully in her basket, her thumb tucked into her mouth. Daniel was 5 years younger than me, always full of big dreams and grand plans. He came out west about 3 years ago, convinced he was going to strike it rich in the gold fields. Instead, he met Anna at a church social in Denver and fell head over heels. They married last spring, and you hadn't heard from them recently. A letter last Christmas. Daniel wrote that they were expecting a baby. I guess it turned out to be 3. Thomas's voice broke slightly. He said they'd named the first one Sarah, after my wife. Said he hoped to bring the family up to visit once the baby was old enough to travel. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. They must have trusted you very much to send the children here, or they had no other choice. Thomas looked down at the baby in his arms, who was beginning to fuss again. Margaret, I meant what I said. I don't expect you to. This is too much to ask. 3 babies, and I don't know the first thing about raising children. Sarah and we tried for years, but never. She always said, maybe it wasn't meant to be. Margaret studied his face in the firelight. She saw grief there and fear, but also something else, a desperate hope that he was trying not to acknowledge. What do you want to do, Thomas? I want to keep them, he said immediately, then shook his head. But that's selfish. They deserve better than a bachelor rancher who can barely keep himself fed. Maybe there's a family in town who could take them, or an orphanage somewhere that could. No. The word came out sharper than Margaret had intended, surprising them both. I'm sorry, but no. These children have already lost their parents. They've been through enough upheaval. They don't need to be separated and sent to strangers. But Margaret, think about what you're saying. You came here expecting to marry a widower and help run a ranch. You didn't sign up to become an instant mother to 3 infants. Margaret looked down at little Mary, who had fallen asleep against her chest, her tiny face peaceful for the first time since they'd found her. Something had shifted inside Margaret the moment she saw these babies. Some long-dormant maternal instinct had awakened with a fierceness that surprised her. Thomas, she said quietly, I left Boston because I was tired of living half a life. I was tired of watching other women have families while I hemmed their dresses, and went home alone to an empty room. When I answered your letter, I was hoping for a chance at something real, a home, a family, a purpose. These babies need us, and perhaps we need them too. Thomas stared at her for a long moment. You're serious? You really think we could do this? Raise them together? I think, Margaret said carefully, that love makes a family, not just blood. These children have lost everything, but they're here now and they're ours if we want them. The question is, do we want them enough to try? Baby Daniel chose that moment to start crying again, a lusty wail that woke both his sisters. Soon all 3 babies were fussing, and Margaret and Thomas sprang into action again, warming more milk and checking diapers. It was chaotic and exhausting, but as Margaret watched Thomas gently rock little Sarah while singing an off-key lullaby, she felt something warm bloom in her chest. It was nearly midnight before all 3 babies were fed, changed and settled back in their basket near the warm fire. Margaret and Thomas sat in exhausted silence, watching the children sleep. We'll need supplies, Margaret said finally. Proper bottles, diapers, baby clothes, and we'll have to figure out sleeping arrangements. They can't stay in that basket forever. There's a room upstairs, Thomas said. Sarah always hoped. Well, she had plans for it. There's not much in there now, but we could set up cribs. And we'll need help. Is there a doctor in town? Someone who knows about babies? Doc Henderson delivered half the babies in the county, and Miss
Marson, the preacher's wife, she's raised 7 of her own. They'll help. They talked quietly for another hour, making plans and discussing practicality. Margaret found herself studying Thomas as they spoke, noting the way his face softened when he looked at the babies, the gentle way he had handled them despite his obvious inexperience. This was not the man she had expected to marry, grief-stricken and suddenly responsible for 3 orphaned children, but perhaps he was exactly the man she needed. "Margaret," Thomas said, as the fire burned low, "I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. If you do this, if you stay and we try to make this work, it won't be a marriage of convenience anymore. These children need stability, love, a real family. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret met his eyes across the dying flame. "Are you asking if I'm prepared to be a real wife and mother, not just a housekeeper who happens to wear a wedding ring?" "I suppose I am." She was quiet for a moment, considering. "I won't lie to you, Thomas. This isn't what I expected when I got on that train in Boston. But I didn't come west looking for an easy life. I came looking for a real one. These babies, they need us, both of us, and maybe building a family together, even under these circumstances, will give us something we both need too." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we'll make it work, somehow." Little Mary stirred in her sleep, making a soft mewing sound, and Margaret immediately went to check on her. The baby's eyes opened, beautiful dark eyes like her uncle's, and she stared up at Margaret with that intense, unfocused gaze of the very young. "Hello, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, stroking the baby's soft cheek. "I know this is all very strange and scary, but you're safe now. Uncle Thomas and I are going to take very good care of you." As if she understood, Mary's little mouth quirked into what might have been a smile, and she settled back into sleep. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes again, but this time they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "She likes you," Thomas said softly, coming to stand beside Margaret. "I hope so. I hope they all will in time." "And us?" Thomas asked. "Do you think we'll like each other in time?" Margaret looked up at him, this man who was about to become her husband, and the father of these orphaned children. "I think," she said, "that we're about to find out." The next few weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights, endless feedings and gradual adjustment. Margaret and Thomas were married in a quiet ceremony at the small church in Copper Creek, with Pastor Williams officiating, and the 3 babies as their only witnesses. Miss Marson had indeed proved invaluable, arriving the day after the babies were found with a wagon full of supplies and enough advice to last a lifetime. "The secret," she told Margaret as they set up the nursery and the upstairs room, "is to take it one day at a time. Babies are more resilient than people think, but they need routine and consistency more than anything." Margaret threw herself into motherhood with the same determination she had once applied to her sewing. She learned to tell the difference between a hungry cry and a tired cry, to change diapers with military efficiency, and to function on 3 hours of sleep. Thomas proved to be a surprisingly devoted father, taking over the night feedings without complaint and singing the same off-key lullabies that gradually began to soothe the babies into sleep. The children thrived under their care. Baby Daniel grew round and cheerful, always ready with a gummy smile for anyone who paid him attention. Sarah was the most serious of the 3, watching everything with grave dark eyes, but she had taken a particular liking to Thomas and would only settle for her longest naps when he rocked her. And little Mary, the smallest and most fragile, had claimed Margaret as her own, crying whenever anyone else tried to hold her for too long. "She knows you're her mama now," Mrs. Morrison observed one afternoon as she watched Margaret pace the kitchen with a fussy Mary. "That child has bonded to you something fierce." Margaret felt a warm glow at the words. She had worried in those first few days that she would never feel like a real mother to these children, that they would always know she wasn't their birth mother. But as the weeks passed, those fears had faded. When Daniel smiled at her, when Sarah reached for her with chubby hands, when Mary finally settled into sleep against her chest, Margaret felt a love so fierce and protective, it sometimes took her breath away. Her relationship with Thomas was evolving too, though more slowly. They were partners in the exhausting business of caring for 3 babies, working together with an efficiency born of necessity. But in the quiet moments, when the children were all napping and they sat together over coffee, or when they passed each other in the hallway during night feedings, Margaret found herself studying this man she had married, looking for signs of the deeper connection she hoped would grow between them. Thomas was unfailingly kind and respectful, but she sensed he was holding part of himself back, perhaps out of loyalty to Sarah's memory, or perhaps simply because their relationship had begun under such unusual circumstance. Margaret was patient, but she found herself longing for more than companionate partnership. She wanted the kind of marriage she had dreamed of, built on love and trust and shared dreams for the future. The turning point came on a cold November evening when Mary fell ill with a fever. Margaret had put all 3 babies down for the night, but an hour later she heard Mary crying. Not her usual demanding wail, but a weak, pitiful sound that sent chills down Margaret's spine. When she picked up the baby, Mary felt burning hot to the touch and wouldn't take her bottle. "Thomas," Margaret called, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "I need you." He appeared in the nursery doorway, took one look at Margaret's face and immediately came to her side. "What's wrong?" "Mary's sick. She has a fever and she won't eat." Margaret's voice shook despite her efforts to stay calm. "Should we send for the doctor?" Thomas felt the baby's forehead and frowned. "She's definitely burning up. It's too late to send for Doc Henderson tonight, but if she's not better by morning." They spent that night taking turns walking with Mary, trying to bring down her fever with cool cloths and to coax her to take small sips of water. The baby was listless and unresponsive, her usual bright personality dimmed by illness. Margaret found herself bargaining with God, promising anything if he would just let this tiny child be all right. It was near dawn when Margaret finally broke down. She was sitting in the rocking chair with Mary, who had been crying weakly for hours, when the tears she had been holding back finally came. "I can't lose her," she whispered. "I know I haven't been her mother very long, but I can't if something happens to her." Thomas knelt beside the rocking chair and put his arms around both Margaret and the baby. "Hey," he said softly, "she's going to be all right. Children get fevers. It's scary, but they're tough. Mary's a fighter." "How do you know?" Margaret asked, tears streaming down her face. "What if we're doing everything wrong? What if we're not enough for them?" "Margaret, look at me." Thomas cupped her face in his hands, his thumb wiping away her tears. "These children are lucky to have you. You've loved them from the moment you saw them. And that love, that's what matters. That's what makes you their mother. Not blood or biology or how long you've known them." Something shifted in that moment as they held each other and the sick baby in the gray dawn light. Margaret saw in Thomas's eyes, not just kindness and respect but love for her, for the children, for the family they were building together. And she realized that somewhere in the chaos of those first few weeks, she had fallen completely in love with this quiet, gentle man, who sang lullabies and changed diapers and worried about 3 babies who weren't even his by blood. "Thomas," she whispered. "I know," he said, and kissed her softly. "I love you too." Mary chose that moment to let out a stronger cry, and when Margaret looked down, the baby's eyes were brighter and more focused than they had been all night. The fever had broken. By the time the sun was fully up, Mary was demanding her bottle with her usual imperious hunger, and Margaret and Thomas were laughing with relief and exhaustion. As they sat together at the kitchen table sharing coffee and watching Mary drain her bottle, Margaret felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. "So," Thomas said, reaching across the table to take her hand, "I guess we're really doing this, the whole family "I guess we are," Margaret agreed. "Think we're up for it. With you, I think I'm up for anything." Christmas that year was unlike any Margaret had ever experienced. The babies were old enough now to be fascinated by the colored paper and ribbons, though they were more interested in eating the decorations than playing with their gifts. Thomas had carved each child a simple wooden toy, and Margaret had sewn them matching Christmas outfits. But the real gift was simply being together. This unlikely family that had formed out of tragedy and circumstance, but was held together by love. On Christmas Eve, as they sat by the fire with the children playing on a blanket at their feet, Margaret began to sing. It was an old Irish lullaby her grandmother had sung to her, a song about love and protection, and the promise that no matter what storms might come, family would always be a safe harbor. One by one the babies settled into sleepy contentment, their eyes heavy and their movements slow. Thomas joined his voice to Margaret's, adding a gentle harmony to the ancient melody, and as the song faded into silence and the children drifted off to sleep, Margaret realized that she had found what she had been searching for all along. Not just a husband or a home, but a purpose, a family, a song that would carry them all safely through whatever might come. Years later, when the children were old enough to ask about their parents and their early years, Margaret would tell them this story. She would tell them about a desperate train ride west, about a basket on a doorstep, about the night their baby sister was sick and how love had finally conquered fear. And always she would end the story the same way. "You came to us as a gift," she would say, "unexpected and precious and perfect. And from the moment we found you, you became the song we sang to chase away the darkness, the melody that made our house into a home." Baby Daniel grew up to be a rancher like his uncle, expanding the family property and raising cattle and horses, with the same gentle strength Thomas had shown. Sarah became a teacher, her serious nature and quick mind making her beloved by generations of children in Copper Creek. And little Mary, who had claimed Margaret so fiercely in those early days, grew up to be a singer, her voice carrying her family's lullabies to stages far beyond the Montana territory. But no matter how far life took them, they never forgot that cold October day when 3 crying babies found their way to a ranch house, where a mail-order bride was waiting to become a mother, and a grieving widower was ready to learn that love multiplies rather than divides, that families can be chosen as well as born, and that sometimes the most beautiful songs are the ones we never planned to sing.